And we're live. Welcome, folks. Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a great day. This is just a short, informal live chat. I've got Josh City from 86 Boxing here with me. Josh, what's up, brother?
Salute. Appreciate you, Random. All good here to discuss the great Sam Langford. Can never get enough of him, right? So, yeah, I'm looking forward to jumping into this.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, folks, this isn't anything like loaded up with content. I just want to talk a little bit about a video I'm working on the bone crushing power of Sam Langford, who fought in a remarkably rich era. But even within that era, he was feared as a puncher. And this wasn't a time when he was even a mid-sized heavyweight. He was a small heavyweight. And later, when he got heavier, where you would say he could be a mid-sized heavyweight, uh, he was still a short guy. He was never like fully, his physicality never fully expressed itself as like a big guy. Even when he got heavier, he was always short. He just had a really respectable reach, especially relative to his height. But he picked up techniques from fighting who's who all the way up through the weights. So I feel like, I don't know. What do you think, Josh? Do you think like part of his advantage is he'd fought some hard hitters from the lower weights. So when he was even smaller than his later size. So as he moved up heavier and heavier, even though the danger increases because the physical oomph behind his opponent's punches, he'd already fought relative to his own size big hitters and had to survive that and sometimes turn the tables on them. Do you think that was like one of his major advantages? Not just experience, but experience being at a disadvantage compared to a heavy hitter. Like he had no business being in there with Jack Johnson in 1906, but he still went all 15 rounds. He got his eye closed, but he went the distance. He got cheers for lasting the limit. Do you think that had a lot to do with how he was able to thrive at those higher weights, being short?
I would certainly think so, given the fact that he came to in an era where there were a number of top caliber fighters across all weights. I would think that just gaining that experience and being in the ring with those individuals, but also some of the behind the scenes stuff, just thinking about sparring, that work that went into preparation, training, and all of that stuff as you were getting ready to fight. Now, he was, I guess you can say, of benefit that being one of those black fighters back then, oftentimes I'd imagine he was working with a number of the other top caliber black fighters that were competing. And you have to think that getting that type of work during that time period was of overall benefit. Just thinking about the likes of him working with George Byers, for instance, who was instrumental in his career and a fighter who was accustomed to fighting individuals who were larger than he, having won the middleweight and heavyweight colored titles, colored world titles, that is, George Byers. So that was someone who was instrumental for Sam Langford in his development. And just thinking about some of those other guys he ran into on his way up, the likes of Joe Gans, Bobby Hollies of the world, number of others that he would have been in there with and dealing with at that particular time. You think a Barbados Joe Walcott. I think sharing some of the tips, sharing some of the information that was picked up by some of those greats who were there in and around this time, I think that led to and added to what would ultimately be a prime and ready Sam Langford, who could traverse the weights and not really have any fear of what was offered at the higher weights, because it was just something that he was accustomed to. You think that in some cases heading up, there are certain limitations, and I'd imagine there might have been some forms of limitations just thinking about the weight of certain fighters. Maybe just dealing with that probably required a lot more of him. But that being said, it was something that I believe he got used to, was accustomed to, and then the experience in dealing with individuals of higher weight at a high level, I would think added to just his overall ability, and therefore that ability to carry the power up that ability to carry the speed, etc. I think all of that played into what made for a elite fighting machine, and that's partly the reason he gets mentioned as the greatest ever, because there was just a high level of variety that saw him as he grew and became the champion that he was. I think that it all played into what it is that made the fighter and the man himself. And therefore, there weren't really any environments, any moments, and any situations in ring that he wasn't used to or that he probably hadn't dealt with. You have to think that, coupled with the fact that we know a lot of these individuals from that period had many fights that were likely not recorded or on the ledger or what we see when we go by one of the record sites. So a lot of those fights also probably had some conditions that we're not accustomed to seeing here at this day and time. And the conditions just in general back then were very different. But you hear about similar stories even to this day, guys like Gervonta Tate Davis being able to knock out guys who were heavyweights, or really put a hurting on them. And you think about him being a smaller fighter, and you just think about Sam Langford, who essentially rose from a similar weight, carried that power up. Now, the differences is there are so many weight classes in between now that a guy like Davis likely wouldn't end up anywhere near the heavyweight division. But back then, it was just a part of the conditions. It was a normality. And that was the case for many, many years, probably here into the latter portion of what we would consider the modern times is when we saw that change start to happen, and seeing fighters rise from some of those lower weights, especially at elite level, became more of a rarity. Here in recent memories, we can think about guys like Roy Jones, who went from middleweight up to heavyweight. We can think about other guys who would have come a little bit before him. But that being said, the notion of a guy coming from around the lightweight limit or lower going up to heavyweight these days is probably something that we are in all likelihood not going to see. But certainly Sam Langford, he was a man of the times. And as far as just dealing with the nature of being in these varying situations, he's one of the individuals that stood out as a rarity, even amongst those where doing things of this nature were normal. So I think that added to it, just as you alluded to.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, it's like he had seen so much, but he also, when we did the other day, we did the fantasy matchup in part 3 of our Prime versus Prime series. We matched Langford with Joe Louis, the great Joe Louis. And there was something I thought afterwards I should have mentioned, which was something I don't think Louis did, but Langford had such an incredible chin, and he was so physically strong and durable that not only did some of his opponents just say, like, if you could even get to him, it wouldn't do anything. But there are reports of him dropping his hands in fights against heavyweights and just taking a few of their best shots, like literally just putting his hands down. I think the beginning of 1911 fought a heavyweight in New York, Atwater, and then in the report he dropped his hands and took 3 of his best shots and just went back to work. Langford had an abnormally tough, like resilience, like ability to sustain, to absorb or just reflect punishment, like often. Not so much from the giant neck, but apparently like his shoulders and chest, the musculature of the upper part of his upper body was just bizarre. And so between all the skills, because he'd fought, a lot of tricky fighters, so he knew a lot of these tricks from firsthand experience at the faster weights. When he gets up to heavyweight, he's had to in his life avoid punishment from larger people than himself, but who moved in an absolute sense more quickly than these heavyweight opponents. And later on, I guess he had said he liked fighting the heavyweights. He's not the only guy to say that. Some of these greats, they say they can't get out of their own way. You have to be awfully nimble and experienced to be on that level. But of course, like as you know, by like say 1911, like he was probably the most. I don't even know if, even though Johnson had been fighting years longer than him, he probably had the most heavy duty overall resume of whoever was competing at heavyweight. Even though not all of those fights, like this is leading up to the Bill Lang fight in 1911. These are some of the guys he'd already taken on. This is only, a little less than halfway through his career as far as in years, the amount of seasons he fought. And it's pretty crazy, like down at lightweight, Patsy Sweeney was quite a battling character, gave him a good hard fight, although I think Langford got him out of there in the 11th or 12th round. But that was a couple fights before he fought the great Joe Gans, who was a knockout specialist, but also one of the most brilliant technical fighters of that whole early era. Got him over 15 rounds. He fought Jack Blackburn. I think they had a 5-fight series, a competitive 5-fight series. Blackburn was brilliant. Obviously, who later trained Joe Louis, who we matched with Langford there. Eventually Langford outgrew Blackburn. He maxed out, even though he did put on weight as he got older, especially when he came out of jail. But Langford grew very quickly. So same with Dave Hawley. The last time they fought, I think Langford knocked one of his teeth out. He's in the top center there, because he had about 10 pounds or more on Hawley. But Hawley gave him a loss the first time they met. But he learned from that. He learned from the punishment. He could survive through fights. Like he had to survive the first fight with Dave Hawley. He had to, by the last round, he was doing every trick he knew that he'd learned so far to survive, to slow the fight down, to survive. But he fought like Elbows McFadden there, second from the right on the top level. McFadden was a blocker. I saw him described as America's greatest blocker. But I've seen photos where he's showing how to like slip the jab, but then you use your own arm to kind of punish the elbow joint, stuff that you couldn't really do today. But McFadden had some serious tricks. He didn't get the nickname Elbows lightly. Like he knew a lot of tricks. But Langford was supposed to fight him in 2003. It got postponed. McFadden refused to fight him. He fought someone else instead. But then in 2004, they did meet, and I guess McFadden landed like twice in the whole fight. 2 light punches in the whole fight. He got schooled, got out of there very quickly. Langford was showing that even guys who were clever, they had to look out for him. They might even, like with Dave Hawley, got the best of him the first time they fought. I can't remember if it was the first or second fight he had with Larry Temple. But one of those first 2 fights, Temple got the best of him, but he would improve on those results, and it's all being fed into the computer. The top right there, great Barbados Joe Walcott, just an incredible puncher, and someone who was physically similar to Langford, except a smaller version. So he was a welterweight who was terrorizing his own size men, and then also fighting middle, light, heavy, up with heavyweight sometimes, and challenged a lot of heavyweights who wouldn't fight him. Probably because the optics of it, they might have thought they could beat him. These guys are very confident, but also, like, what if you don't look amazing? Because actually, I saw in the report when Jack Johnson, dead center there in the graphic, when he fought Langford, there were different takes, right? One of the guys was like, Langford deserved all the credit for his showing. There were also writers saying that Johnson showed he may not be championship material simply because he couldn't destroy the much smaller guy. So there was a threat as far as like these fairly independent newspaper writers. There was the danger that if you fought someone that you should destroy and you don't, they count that against you, even if you know that they're deadly. That's Barbados Walcott was in that position. Sam Langford was in that position later, where there was question whether or not he could beat Johnson, because Johnson was so much bigger and brilliant himself in his own right. But Johnson didn't want the fight. Broke contract in May of 1909. But then, as a result of that, the National Sporting Club in England, they wanted to strip Johnson. They said he forfeited because he broke this contract he signed. So now the winner of Langford and William Iron Hague, to them, that was for the championship. That doesn't mean anyone else is going to take it seriously. U.S. is where the money at that time, where the action was going down, most of the business, but not entirely though. Obviously, Johnson had beaten Tommy Burns to unify the colored in the white heavyweight title. Basically, that happened in Australia. There's some big fights in Australia, but and then later the French considered one of Jeanette and Langford's fights to be for the title again because they considered Johnson in forfeit. So I think the way part of the reason people might not understand the true danger of Langford is just because the official records and things like that, he gets left off in a lot of summaries. If you think that's fair to say. Like they'll talk about Burns, Johnson, and then they'll go to Willard and keep on moving. But this was an incredible era. And but like just keep going through the thing. I don't want to spend too long on all the stuff in this graphic. So we'd seen all those guys in the top row. Center left there, Andy Watson, very experienced, an instructor as well as a competitor and a promoter of sorts. And then young Peter Jackson next to him, two-handed puncher, very good grappler. This is one of the people through their fight series, Langford would have picked up a lot of tricks about grappling. Then you have the close-up there, the great Joe Jeanette, a cardio machine, but an all-around great fighter, cardio machine. Jack Johnson, dead center. Jim Barry, tough guy, could really hit, knocked Langford down in one of their fights. But he'd seen that. Big Sandy Ferguson, who was Canadian, but he fought out of Chelsea, Massachusetts. And, he was a big, tough guy. He was skilled for his size. He wasn't the top heavyweight, but he had some moments there where he really showed himself. But I see in the papers they had questions about him. They were saying, well, we don't know if he's world class, but if the recent showings by him are anything to judge by, maybe we got something here. Then the Italian Bearcat, Tony Ross, Langford knocked him out in one of their fights, but that was one of his vicious short power knockouts. Fireman Jim Flynn, the first time they fought, just under a round. Al Kubiak, he gave Al Kubiak some setbacks. Then third from the left on the bottom row, Iron Haig, he fought Iron Haig, much bigger guy than himself, flattened him out in the fourth round. He did get knocked down. And I guess I should mention that Langford could be knocked down because he wasn't very big, and the guys he's fighting have a lot of size. But that's separate from being able to hurt him. You know what I mean, Josh? He could be knocked down. He was in some fights. But as far as hurting him or stopping him, barring an injury, that was a different thing. You know what I mean?
Certainly. I think that some of that build up, that wear and tear, just being able to deal with and having involvement with guys who could punch, guys who are bigger, etc. And you start to kind of build up a stealth towards such things. Like you mentioned, of course, it wasn't that he could just take any and every shot at all points of his career, but during his peak, of course, he could hang with the very best of them, and he would even stop some of the bigger, larger heavyweights from the era who were actually outweighing him by significant amounts and were just overall bigger individuals for him to be dealing with, especially at his size. But he became accustomed to kind of just dealing with those types of situations and having that understanding that he was going into these contests with individuals that could lay a hurting on him. And you just try and build up that resistance in what you do in preparation, as well as what you get and go through real time. You see that sometimes in training camps, even for individuals here today, where they are really looking towards and getting themselves prepped for what may be coming from an opponent. And you'll hear stories of individuals in sparring, for instance, going against guys who are bigger and not having much rest in between those rounds, if any, or throwing in a fresh fighter every 2 to 3 rounds. I think a lot of that helps to kind of just build up that resistance, get you prepped for what could be coming, as well as what could come at any stage of the fight, because there are a lot of individuals, Langford's one of these, who could carry his power later in rounds as well. So if you think about what can be done when a fighter is at his freshest there early on, you have to plan for that and dealing with that type of power, as well as when you are not at your freshest and the individual you're going against, while maybe not at their freshest either, has the type of power that could carry into those types of rounds. But yeah, I think a lot of that is some of the resistance that is built up, that is planned for, and that you have the mentality and mindset for dealing with. So some of that is the physical side, but there's a larger element of it that is also the mental piece. And if you think about it, a lot of these individuals are in tip-top physical shape. So they're essentially built for lasting however they need to last, but it's how do you deal with such when you have someone else looking to throw you off of your game or looking to take you out. And if they're in that same situation with you, what can you harken back on to push you through to move you past that sort of mental will or that mental aspect of another opponent in front of you who's thinking in the same regard? So I think, yeah, just working and dealing with it from a mental standpoint was also a big piece of it as well. And some of that experience in dealing with these individuals certainly played into it.
Yeah, and it's like he'd already, and apparently Langford, he left home when he was young. So he wasn't in a good home situation, and so he'd been out and fighting, as just part of the course of keeping himself safe in like this uncertain time. He's a teenager. He wasn't very big as a teenager. He wasn't well fed either. So, but he had to fight at times. So he could already throw down before he got to a club and got trained by some quality fighters. Jimmy Walsh. I got a graphic here somewhere of him sparring with Jimmy Walsh. And this is after the early years this is after the Lennox Club is gone, his early thing. This I think is from later. This is like I believe at least 1907 or later. So he was fighting out of the Lennox Club in like 03, 04. And I think 05 they renamed them. I think actually in 04 the Lennox renamed it. Some of the clubs in Boston closed and some of them renamed themselves. There was a young fighter who died at the end of 03 and early 04, the police started showing up at events, and there was uncertainty as to whether the Commissioner Emmons was going to shut the whole thing down in the city. And actually they showed up to one of Langford's events. He was fighting the second fight with Belfield Walcott in 1904. The two policemen were there, and they had so they didn't. The paper said they had legit fights, they put on spirited stuff, but I'm not sure if personally I don't know how much it affected the fact the cops were there. I know there were other ones where they tried to say, oh well, this doesn't count for any kind of proposed ban because the fighters don't know who they're going to compete against until they get there. They had all the kind of little ways, and it was already an end run with the athletic clubs around not selling tickets to a prize fight. No, we're selling tickets to our club members, and one of the things our athletic club does is put on fights for their entertainment, but it's based on their membership. It's not tickets to a fight. And this, so they were doing a dance this time to get boxing legitimized, but in the areas where boxing was happening, it was incredibly rich. There was so many great seasons happening. And for Langford, he had great early seasons at the lower weights. He spent basically a year at lightweight or just above, and then just above. He spent the second full year, 04, he's a welterweight. 05, now he could probably make welter, but he's basically fighting as a tiny middleweight, and he's fighting middleweights, heavy, first heavyweight bout against the great Joe Jeanette. 06, it's like a blend, middle and above, including fight with Johnson, but he was small, he was walking around in trained shape, he was walking around below today's middleweight limit. He's fighting Jack Johnson, who's up, I believe, in the 180s at that point in his career. And Johnson got heavier later, but he was, you trade mobility, size and mobility. Langford later, when he was heavier, and maybe even hit in an absolute sense, he hit harder when he was 195, 200, but he didn't have his mobility, so the delivery system was changed. But Johnson wasn't always a giant guy. That's him probably in the middle there. He was always ripped, but he got heavier and heavier as he got older. It's just his skill let him keep it going. But Langford, here we go. I don't think that's Langford in 06. I think that's actually Langford in 1908. I'd have to look it up again. I can't quite remember. There's Johnson, smack in his prime. You can see he's absolutely rip cut. But Langford had no business going 15 rounds with him. So that's why they cheered, and then some people use it to attack Johnson because, of course, in 06, he's trying to fight for the title. He's the colored heavyweight champ. He wants to fight and unify those titles. He doesn't get it till the end of 1908, which is unfortunate, because if you don't want too many separate pyramids. We have that problem in mixed rules all these different champions, but they're not unifying those lineages. You just have all these separate pyramids. And because, well, I'm not going to get into MMA contracts, but long story short, if you're a champion, you kind of need to lose to get out of for that contract to end, with only a few exceptions. But yeah, so Langford didn't always get his opportunity, but talking about his hitting power, like here's a picture of him older, obviously with Joe Louis. You can see how short he is with Louis, but you can also see that the heads aren't that. The difference in the size of their heads, although obviously Langford's an older man, but you can see that barrel chest. Now that he's obviously got extra on there, but look at him compared to Joe Louis. Look at the breadth of Langford's chest in that graphic. That's the older version, obviously, but when he was younger, he was a cartoon. So sometimes there are reports like he'd get into the ring and then people would think it was a mismatch. The people who didn't know what was up, the casuals, I suppose you could say, until he took his robe off. And then you see he's built he's literally a muscle triangle. So, but not everyone fought him scared. So we know he could really crack, because there were guys who were absolutely fearless. They went in against him, but if they weren't careful, they got cracked. And some of these guys who got the best of him, like Gunboat Smith, got the best of him in, I think I got it wrong the other day. I think it was in 1913 he got the best of him. And his people were bragging on him. And Langford, the report said he was out of shape for the fight. But nonetheless, that's his fault. But Gunboat was this and this. And so they were matched again to fight 14. And Langford absolutely put him through it. Gave him the full business. So some of these fighters, they didn't always get the full business. But everyone knew they'd been in a fight when he was about it. That included giving up, as you know, Josh, 40 pounds the first time he fought McVeigh. He grew and closed that gap, but he gave up 40 pounds to a two-handed knockout puncher who could fight forwards and backwards, had stopping power. Probably the strongest of the four kings. Jack Johnson seemed to think so. McVeigh was the strongest between him, Jeanette, Langford, and McVeigh. So he was the strongest. Langford was the hardest hitter. Jeanette had the best conditioning and was possibly the most dangerous in a long fight. Then Johnson was the cleverest. That was pretty much agreed upon by most people. Like they all had wonderful attributes all around, but they had a specialty. You mean just like Prime Roy Jones Jr.? He had a lot of great things about him, but I think you could say his speed was exceptional. For his size, the size Jones was moving around at. And Langford had that too, like short power, but quick power. But he was able to push really big guys backwards. He was also able to fight like the war of attrition with Joe Jeanette. They had some furious fights. They also had a couple fights that were more lackluster, but most of their fights were really intense. And as you know, we have the footage from their 10th fight. Thank goodness we actually have footage of Jeanette fighting. Although we don't get to see these guys schooling people that don't know their style real well. I mean, that was their 10th fight. So Josh, what do you think would happen if Frazier and Ali had fought earlier in their careers and they end up having a 14-fight series? Other than being awesome, how do you think that would go? Frazier, Ali, 14 fights, like Langford and Jeanette.
Well, they had styles that matched pretty well, just like Langford, Jeanette, and some of those other series we saw Langford involved with. I think that they probably would have gotten a bit worn out earlier than they did in their careers. And you think about that, neither had a post 100 fight career. For Ali, it was in that 60, 70 range, somewhere in there. For Frazier, around 30 something fights, under 40 from what I recall. So I would imagine that the wear and tear would have likely gotten to them at some point in their career, and probably would have done more damage than what was the case for the fight series that they were involved with, especially thinking about that coupled with them dealing with other opponents in or around those fights or the series of fights between them. Now, given that the styles meshed pretty well, I think that they all would have, in most likelihood, been very good fights. Some of them would have been excellent fights. And I'd imagine, depending on the stage, that would determine such. early on with them being younger, then they would likely be able to deal with it more of a rapid pace or more of a recurring pace. But certainly, as they started to get older and get more towards the back end, then you would see the changes. You would see the subtle changes. The fights probably wouldn't be quite the same as it were when they were in their prime and peak condition in both mind and body and didn't have as much wear and tear. But it would certainly be a treat for the fans. If you think about the 3 fights we got between Ali and Frazier, all 3 are for the most part held in high regards. The first one being considered the fight of the century, so much at stake during that fight. Then just going through it to even the last one, which you could argue was probably the more grueling of all of the contests between the 2 of them. And it really made them huge names in the sport. They were already names, but just having those type of fights to be coupled with the name just adds to it, and it really pushes you to that status, especially that legendary status. And if you think about it from a heavyweight standpoint, both are in that legendary status. If you polled anyone for their greatest heavyweights, you're going to get the likes of Ali and Frazier somewhere in the midst there early. Now, with Langford, Jeanette, and of course some of the others that Langford was involved with, because he had crazy series with the likes of Harry Wills as well. You just think about that, along with Sam McVeigh, and it just goes to show you he was a different breed. A lot of those guys were just different breeds. I think they adjust to whatever time frame or time set they're in. So for Ali, Frazier, if they were in this particular period of the Langfords and McVeighs, etc., I think they make adjustments, and we kind of see them acquiesce to the conditions for that time. Likewise for Langford, etc., in one of these other eras, because they are in rarefied eras as far as their standing amongst all of the fighters in the history of the sport. And I think a lot of that kind of plays into what the expectation would be were they fighting in varying eras. So for Langford, yeah, he's just one of those individuals. When you just think about some of the conditions, we're talking about these series of fights, contests at a very high level, with him being on the smaller end, especially in regards to heavyweights, in where we tend to kind of rate some of the great heavyweights in history from a size perspective. He is one of the highest rated who is on the smaller end. You think about him and Rocky Marciano, he's another one that'll be kind of thrown in that mix. These are guys who are on the smaller end when we think about heavyweights. Then Langford, of course, smaller than Marciano even, and just dealing with the level of competition that he was able to deal with, regardless of the size. So just legendary stuff overall. And yeah, 15 fight series between the likes of Ali, Frazier, certainly the fans win.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put the toughness of Langford's schedule in perspective, when you just talk about great opponents, and he had hundreds of fights against fighters you wouldn't say were great, but a lot of them were very powerful contenders, or former champs, former contenders. Like, these were world-class talent, but like just great fighters and just great heavyweights. Take out the Walcott, take out Gans, take out Ketchel, and just talk about, although Ketchel, interestingly, some writers thought that it would be Ketchel or Langford to turn the trick against Johnson, not the other big heavyweights, not Al Kaufman, not the other guys. A lot of people, they really thought Langford, I guess maybe they thought the speed to power ratio was in their favor. Johnson could crack, but he would wear people down. He was a defensive genius, especially by the time he was had unified the championship. He didn't defend the colored title after he won from Tommy Burns, so it was up for grabs that same year. Basically, from the point where he refused to fight Langford to the fight he had contracted to fight. So he wasn't he didn't stay undisputed, but he was undisputed for some months there. The rest of December, 1908 in the first 4.5 months of 1908. He was like the first properly undisputed champion. Jack Johnson deserves a lot of credit for that. And he took the short end of the purse fighting Burns. He made a good purse, but he didn't make near what Burns did. Burns set a record for the money he took to fight Johnson. So big shout out to Johnson. But once he had unified those titles, the guys like Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, he wasn't interested in that. He largely, people say he drew the co-line, but he did fight battling Jim Johnson, another heavyweight, a dangerous heavyweight who was very strong and who fought a tremendous high-level schedule himself, but not as good as the other guys. But he did fight. So Johnson didn't strictly draw the co-line. He just wasn't going to fight the top guys among his fellow black fighters, but still deserves a lot of credit because Johnson, as you know, did a ton before he even got the fight with Burns. He already had a really great career leading up to the Burns fight. So the stuff afterwards was almost like cherry on the cake, But as all of this relates to Langford, the boxing librarian, Hardline Boxing Talk, did a great live on why he rates Langford over Greb a couple days ago. I was listening to it, and there was a great point there. Part of it was he was saying it is impressive that Greb, because he didn't have that stopping power, he couldn't rely on it. So he had to win the rounds against all these great fighters, some of whom were also experts at winning the rounds. So, but the fact that Langford had the power that's an extra layer of his greatness, his stopping power. And I think I also subscribe to that sort of that train of thought. Like there is skill can make up for not having crushing power, but in fights, because of what judging is and because it's subjective, and it seems like the fan bases are always a little bit up in arms from every week over some of these judging decisions or reffing decisions. Being able to stop the guy kind of takes it out of the hands of the judges. And so Langford joked at times, like he brought his own judge, he hold up his fist. And he was guys like Wills, McVeigh, Jeanette, Johnson, who else? Gunboat Smith, Jim Flynn, all those guys were like Langford hits like you couldn't believe. And but it was also proven he wasn't someone who then people would dance away from him, and you just have the myth of the knockout power like certain other knockout guys. When they get up to a certain weight, it doesn't translate up. His punching power translated better to heavyweight, possibly because of all of his because he had the toughness to survive. He had the chin for heavyweight. He had the physicality for heavyweight, even though he was short. Everything, he wasn't small. He had normal legs, the legs of a middleweight, but he had the upper body of a Hercules. And his power, like once he got to a certain weight, whenever 160 or above, although he probably really heavily trained to make 160 when he fought McVeigh, because he was fighting a 200-pound knockout guy for 20 rounds. So, maybe if he hadn't been on like some crazy training schedule, maybe when he was like by 165, he's absolutely crushing. And it gets worse and worse as he gets up to 175, 180. And but it was proven guys tried to dance away from him. Some of them were able to take it the distance, but a lot of times he was so good at cutting the ring, and he could take so much. So I brought it up earlier. So when we matched Lewis and Langford, what I should have mentioned was although he didn't do it with a Joe Louis level puncher, Langford was confident enough in his own chin to drop his hands at times and let people just take their best shot. And that could give us a sense of why he was so feared. Because even if you punch hard, even if you have great output, right? Even if you have a pretty good chin, he has an epic chin and he hits harder. So you can't win a firefight. That's why McVeigh was not a stupid man. McVeigh was a clever fighter and a clever person. That's why he fought on the retreat. Because even though his specialty was just cracking the shit out of guys with either hand, he wasn't trying to go in and get destroyed by Langford, because Langford was a little tank. And later, when he was less mobile, he was still, as you know, he was still dangerous as hell. But like we're talking about in his prime in this video, I'm having so much fun talking, Josh. I'm forgetting that this is supposed to be previewing the video I'm making. But here's an article that talks about a few of his. I'll leave it up for a while if you want to read it, folks, while I babble. At his best, like Bob Fitzsimmons was a thin guy, but with a tremendous back and shoulder muscles from and a massive hitter. Langford was the next guy after him. Neither guy was big. then I'm not sure. Dempsey was probably. Would you say Dempsey was considered the hardest hitter of Dempsey's era? Like the like once Langford wasn't past 1920, like 1922 or on, where Langford's largely, or I actually got Flowers. But anyway, say 1923, that era, that's so like Wills, Fulton, Dempsey, these guys were the hitters, right? In the late teens leading into the 20s. Is that fair, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I think a lot of it ties to sort of the popularity aspect of Dempsey, and of course the strides that have been made from a visual standpoint as well. We have some of that stuff on video. So certainly Dempsey is probably amongst the top as far as if we were to poll the average fan on that era. Certainly others in the mix there, as you mentioned, Wills, big time puncher, Fred Fulton, big time puncher there. And I think it could certainly vary. You have those in some of the lower weights who were on that level as well. Think about George Carpentier. He was considered to be somewhat of a puncher during that period. So I just think it ties to just that sheer popularity of Dempsey and the ability to have seen him operating at that level, of course, with some of the epic knockouts and battles we've seen in the history of the sport. I think that added to it. There was a sort of mystique surrounding it, that power of Jack Dempsey. So he would certainly be probably the top in a poll, but certainly others around there who were just as vicious in terms of what they were able to dish out, as you mentioned, along the lines of the great Black Panther Harry Wills.
Yeah. So it's like if we look at heavyweight boxing back through all the way back through generations, the guys considered the hardest punchers. And hard punching isn't just about muscle; it's technique, it's kinetic linking, and so experience. But they weren't always. I don't know if there was more often than not they were smaller on the heavyweight spectrum, but certainly enough that you couldn't say just being big makes you hit harder, because you got to actually deliver the punches. I mean, what was that guy's name? Valuev? That guy is an actual giant, right? But that doesn't mean that he has the pinpoint precision and the speed and combination power of a Joe Louis. So if you put Valuev in there with a Joe Louis, it might be a bad night, because can he get out of the way of that rocket of a right hand that Joe Louis had? No, I don't know. It's, Louis fought some big fellas, and if you couldn't get out the way, it was a bad night. It was like that with Langford. Now, Harry Wills had a gigantic reach advantage over him, but even in a fight he'd been winning, it got stopped in the 19th round. Langford's power was ridiculous, and even though Wills was a hard hitter and he had all that long frame to throw body shots from a million miles away, like imagine that kind of reach but he wasn't automatically able to beat Jeanette McVeigh and Langford in the earlier part of his career, several seasons into his fighting career. Now, later seasons, he hit his prime. He was almost like I wonder if I have a graphic. Hold on a second.
And real quick, while you're searching for that, while you're searching for that, I just wanted to say that I'd imagine if David Hay, who rose from cruiserweight, could hurt Nikolai Valuev, that is a 7-foot heavyweight, then I'd imagine Joe Louis could put him in a world of hurt.
Yeah, it's like it depends on obviously the way the styles match up, but like other great punchers, like Foreman is considered a great puncher for good reason, and his fight style was more clever than perhaps he's been always given credit for. But it wasn't. But he was great at posting off of guys. That's something Langford did, although George was doing it as a big guy. So like with Frazier, he's like, yo, if you're down there, I can kind of just push on you, and I can land some shots, and you saw Frazier, as great as he was, he had some real trouble with that, to put it mildly. But Langford's power came from, or then you have like the great Lennox Lewis, who had power. He didn't always fight in that style, but he could really bully fellas. There's a great interview with Emmanuel Stewart on Rummy's Corner that he posted after he passed away, and he was talking about that with Lewis. Like, didn't always know what you're going to get, but he could finesse, and he could also be a real bully. And Langford had some of that himself. And in fact, even though he wasn't necessarily a one-hitter finisher, Ali could do that. He could finesse guys, but when you see him get serious, he's dead serious. He's vicious. I mean, he was so charismatic. I think sometimes maybe we forget, like, to do this sport, as rough a sport as this, guys are made of iron. Even the nice guys. There are no wimps involved, especially at the highest level. But he had just disproportionate power for his size. So once he got up into walking around as a super middle or more, it was scary. And just like Fitz, just like Dempsey smacked the crap out of Fulton, destroyed him. Fulton was largely successful before and afterwards. He was a finisher. And Dempsey was like, he didn't care that he was small. He absolutely ripped him apart. Lewis beat some guys larger than himself, beat them down. And Langford himself was able to stop Wills. When Wills was maybe 25 fights into his career, somewhere in that range. So if we compare that today, that's not a rookie. It's just that back then, compared to a guy like Langford, Langford had, within like 21 months of turning pro, he had at least 29 fights. He had, as a pro, he had one in 1902, and then he had at least 28. I think it's 28 in 1903. So yeah, Wills wasn't experienced like that, but at heavyweight, he was, he had a heavyweight experience. Langford's first heavyweight fight was against Joe Jeanette in 1905. So he'd only been fighting for a few years, and he's fighting someone who became one of the greats of the heavyweight division. So I think that worked in Langford's favor. Like some of these other greats, like Ali, if instead of having an amateur career, he just started as a pro at 16 or whatever, his career would look different. I don't know if it would look better or worse, because obviously he learned a lot in those ranks. But Langford didn't. He won an amateur tournament, had another amateur bout, and then he turned pro. He got stripped of his amateur status by the athletic union, and so they just ripped off as a pro. So I guess for some people, they would look at the amateur career and factor that into just overall accomplishment. Langford didn't have that luxury. He needed to get some money going. But he wasn't the large guy. To circle way back to the point I had started to kind of make, he wasn't a large guy. Lots of the scariest punchers are not large guys. Fitz was feared. Even by like big bull men, did not want to get cracked by Fitz. Dempsey, it was almost better to have the finesse, although not too much of a size. Don't give him size, but you don't want to be like much bigger than him, because he ripped apart Fulton and Willard with ease. Just vicious beatings because his speed to power. And Joe Louis was more of like a mid-size, but earlier in his career, he wasn't super heavy, and he just a finishing type fighter. Langford was in those ranks, and that got him a lot of wins, even in fights he might have not been getting the best of. He could afford to lose rounds to bring home the thing. When he stopped Tiger Flowers, he definitely lost that first round. Well, I guess it's not a must system, 10-point must, but whatever. 10-7. It was a vicious first round, but he ate so much. But he still got it done because he could do that. Other fighters have that experience. Fitz was like that. You could be beating Fitz if you were really good, but you better look out for every second of the fight. So I think in this video, what I'm going to try and explore, I'm trying to relate Langford and his size and the era he fought in to other great punchers of other eras, and relate it to the era they fought in, like the types of fighters they were able to beat. Dempsey didn't have an enormous career, but he beat the crap out of some guys who were bigger than him. And then, didn't always, he wasn't very active once he won the championship, but he did a lot, considering some of those years were inactive. But I think part of the key of Langford's success was that he fought seasons. He fought in a time when you'd have a season of action. And Josh, when we did our video on Harry Wills, he had seasons. Some of these guys had seasons. By the time you get to like Ali's era, they're having good years of boxing. It's not like today, one fight a year or whatever it's become. But they're not necessarily fighting. You wouldn't necessarily call it seasons, or it would be borderline. You know what I mean? Like Foreman, Frazier, and Ali, or even Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes, like almost like in a Harry Wills position where you come after Jack Johnson and the shine, and you're there. You know, he came after Ali, but he was like so good, just born a couple years too late, I guess. You know, Calzaghe like that. Imagine Calzaghe. He said that in an interview. Oh, and he regrets. Yeah, I regret I wasn't born 3 years earlier. Fight Bank Collins, Eubank, and make all the money. It's like these guys, you know, today there's a reason they fight less. But if we're just talking about proven hitting ability, Langford had that schedule that did it. And he fought seasons so much. I think I don't have a graphic here from, you might remember, Josh. I did with the Boxing Librarian. We did a countdown of Sam Langford's top 5 toughest seasons. And I've got a graphic somewhere. But that's the kind of years. Yeah, here it is. That's the kind of years he was fighting. Go find that on my channel, folks. I had a nice little talk. I think that was the first live I did between myself and BL. But he had so many tough seasons that we actually had to narrow it down to 5, and we didn't agree on all of them. I mean, that was a really tough live stream to prep for, because you had to factor all the adversity he faced. And, you know, later in his career, Josh, fair to say, he was getting by on his power later on. His power and experience, because he wasn't as mobile and he was blind in one eye and he couldn't see that good out of the other eye. So he was a heavy enough hitter that he was dangerous if he wasn't a power puncher, he would have been just a sitting duck. Guys would just bullet him around, you know, if he didn't have that crack later on. Oh, Josh on mute. So anyway, folks, oh man, look at it. It's like a million things in the chat. Oh, see, 86 is holding it down. He's responding in the chat. Yeah, Big Bear says, I've never seen Langford get that much recognition. Yeah, I think he gets overshadowed by Johnson. Johnson is so famous, and the dynamic between Johnson and not just the boxing community, but more so like the white public, the racist parts of the public, I should say. That dynamic was structurally important in a way that Langford, being the other guy, just like Wills and Dempsey's massive stardom, although it was different than Johnson's. So Harry Wills doesn't get his credit, because it would take away from generically explaining the success of the most famous guys of that era. So if you go, oh, Jack Johnson, he was so great, and he beat Tommy Burns, and then he ducked his next fight, broke contract, wouldn't fight Sam Langford, who then chased him for the rest of his championship career until he lost to Jess Willett. That's not good. Or like Jack Dempsey, like fought a tremendous schedule, you know, smashed Fulton, won some high-level stuff, got the big fight, destroyed Willard, and then wouldn't fight Harry Wills, even though he was the other top guy, and fighting the guys he wouldn't fight. It doesn't work. And that's why people, when you're talking about popular documentary style, they don't put that stuff in there. And so there's sort of the mythology that builds up in their head. The seeming continuity is off. So luckily with the internet, Josh, we've talked about this. With the internet, we can, we can find out things that weren't easily accessible to other people unless they were independently wealthy and just spent their whole lives traveling library to library.
Certainly.
And so, we're very blessed. And I think that's partly why guys like Langford and Greb, as people look and they utilize the tools we have available to us now, they go, wait a minute, holy cow. Like Dempsey beating Willard in 19, that was the big story, but Greb went 45-0 that year. And so, looking back from it now, which do I think is more impressive? Well, to me, I mean, Greb, that was like possibly the greatest season anyone ever fought in the history of the sport. Dempsey had a good year. He beat the inactive champion, but the fame that resonates from that in the storybooks is different. So that's something that's being addressed now. You have such great content on your channel, Josh. Looking at one of your more popular videos is, how good was John Sullivan, right? John L.
Yep.
That's like you're bringing, or you have the video on Fulton. I mean, they have all these different videos. There's so many, and you've done these live streams as well and shorts. Check out 86 Boxing, folks. There's a ton of stuff on there. you know, and then we have like scrapbook boxing. If you look at that channel, he has thousands of videos and sharing parts of his personal collection and stories and personal experience. It's incredible. Boxinglibrarian.com, where you can find Hardline Boxing Talks, like his own website, but also Hardline Boxing Talk, all these great careers, resumes. So YouTube and the internet in general is helping us raise awareness of some of these other great careers, because, you know, in a strictly sporting sense, Langford was a wonder and was reported as such, you know, and so much that there were like lots of poems about fighters ducking Langford, in spite of him having more Hall of Fame fights than Hall of Fame level fights, today's Hall of Fame, than anyone else. Like, he was still massively avoided by other great fighters, champions, and Hall of Famers and contenders. It's pretty wild. So he was able to do a lot because he was so willing, and it could have been even more epic. So he had fights we don't know about, and but he also had fights he couldn't get that he wanted, and in spite of that, had this ridiculous career. Some of that was the experience leading to him being this premier knockout artist. That's what my video is gonna explore, and it's gonna be more of like accessible. So I'm gonna do it in the manner of, I'm building it now as in the manner of a more like a popular appeal documentary, but I'm not leaving out the stuff that's often left out, because I'm not trying to deal with 80 years of heavyweight boxing. I'm dealing with just his career. So hopefully people enjoy it. It's a little bit different than sort of the nerdy approach I take on a lot of these, because I'm fascinated by this. I'm doing this one with more like the broadcaster voice and classical music. So hopefully it's like brings some entertainment. But folks, if you really want to learn about Langford, I would recommend starting here. Clay Moyle's excellent book. It's a little frayed there. It's actually, now it's in 3 pieces, 3 chunks with it. But that was like half destroyed there. That is a great book. That's a great read. That should give you a sense, especially his prime, give you a really detailed sense of what people thought of him and what he was able to do. That's him knocking Bill Lang down there on the cover. That was in England, and he absolutely destroyed the man. The guy fouled out. He didn't get knocked out, but it was a mercy stoppage. This fight was a bloodbath. Lang had, you know, whatever, 30 pounds on Langford. Didn't matter. He was chased all over the ring. And Langford was, you know, even great heavyweights like Jeanette there on the left and McVeigh in the center had to stay out of the way of that power. That baby could hit. That's what everyone agreed on. So that's why I wanted to do a video specifically on that. And Josh, what on your channel, what are some videos you'd say you've done that deal with like heavy hitters? Who are some of the heavy hitters of history for their size that you've already touched on?
Salute. So I think that we think about heavyweights when thinking about that. One you had mentioned, of course, the Fred Fulton video. So he was a heavyweight, about 6'5", 6'5.5", can vary at times. Probably weighed around 200 pounds, just a little bit above 200 pounds, but he was actually one of the biggest hitters, punchers that the heavyweight division has seen, has kind of gone under the radar in his most high profile fights that would have got him in that trajectory to fight for a world heavyweight title, though it should have happened despite such. He lost to Jack Dempsey and Harry Wills, knocked out by both of those guys. But Fulton himself, he was a guy who had a pretty impressive resume when you just look at overall who he went up against and what he was able to do as far as his knockout percentage in those wins. It was a very high percentage. And I think that speaks to just his ability to just punch from an overall perspective. He started out kind of as a wrestler, and they saw the promise, especially given the size, and he became a very formidable fighter there in the heavyweight division out of Minnesota. And Minnesota has a pretty solid, deep fighting history and a number of top level elite talents, especially thinking about it from a historic standpoint, who stand out amongst the greatest ever. So definitely look up Minnesota fighters and you'll get an understanding of what I'm mentioning. But Fred Fulton, most certainly, he's one of those individuals. Another one, Jimmy Wild. If you think about Jimmy Wild, This was a guy who at times weighed under 100 pounds, and he'd be fighting guys that were 100 plus, and he would be able to knock these individuals out. Jimmy Wild in the plus 100 knockouts club, small fighter, the mighty Adam. We have a video on him just kind of speaking to some of his bigger, more high profile fights and what he was able to do in the ring. But certainly one of the big puncher representing Wales and arguably the greatest Welsh fighter. Certainly, arguments can be made, but just given his size and look at it from a pound for pound perspective, one of the bigger punchers in the history of the sport. Another one, Barbados Joe Walcott. You think about the likes of Barbados Joe Walcott at 5'1", and he's actually shorter than Jimmy Wild, and he fought from lightweight up, even knocking out heavyweights. One of the great things, of course, is him defeating Joe Chewinski, who we know fought at heavyweight, someone who knocked out Jack Johnson. But Barbados Joe Walcott was one of these individuals at 5'1", could stop guys who were much bigger than him. And he was fearless there in the ring. Some individuals mentioned him in the chat in this very video that we're going through. Excuse me, but Barbados Joe Walcott, he's one of those individuals, and probably, I just think about a list of fighters I most want to see in operation on video, just thinking if we had footage of some type of them actually fighting, Barbados Joe Walcott, he's high on the list for me because of the fact that I like to see how he used his size to his advantage in order to stand out and become a stellar fighter in his career. Certainly, arguably amongst the few greatest welterweights to ever compete in the sport. So he's one of those individuals we have a video on that is a big puncher in that sense. And some of these individuals are not necessarily one-punch knockout artists, but they packed enough heat to be able to get you in and out of the ring in short order. Another one I think about who goes a bit underrated, who is also a very solid puncher, was who I mentioned, George Byers. This is a guy who always came in tip-top shape. As mentioned, he won the world heavyweight, or the colored world heavyweight and colored world middleweight title, routinely fought guys bigger than him. You're talking about $150 is probably his primal fighting weight. But that being said, he would win those titles, as mentioned, as well as compete with some of the best fighters of the era in his time. And he didn't have a extensive and very long career. He couldn't get some of the premier fights he wanted for the world titles. But that being said, another one of those guys who goes a bit underrated in some sense, because many individuals don't know about him. And you'll see a depiction on the screen for those viewing. You can just see that he was in stout, superb condition. And that was one of the highlights of George Byers, learned under the tutelage of Old Chocolate George Godfrey, who is reported to be a cousin within the family line. And they both came from the same neighborhood. And when Byers decided it was time to leave and boxing was the trade that was going to get him out of there, followed the footsteps of George Byers. And interestingly enough, and this is mentioned in the Byers video, but there was actually a reported backroom contest. We think about private fights or fights taking place that we don't have recorded in any official capacity, but there was actually a contest between Byers and Barbados Joe Walcott in George Godfrey's gym at one point. And the understanding and what was being reported was that Byers really gave it to the great Barbados Joe Walcott. And I think that just shows you how formidable he was as a fighter, to think that he pretty much handled Barbados Joe Walcott in that particular setting. Now, who knows? And of course, in a series of fights, or if we're actually go on to whatever stage of the career, you can imagine that Barbados Joe Walcott will be right there and look to get that get back, as we say. But certainly George Byer is someone worth highlighting. And then, some of the others that are out there, the likes of Joe Gans, another plus 100 knockout guy. Many know about him for sure. But that being said, Joe Gans, just thinking about his ability, what he was able to do in the ring, he, like I said, not necessarily considered one punch knockout artist, but certainly could get the job done in a major way. And as I've mentioned before, he does have a fight out there that's on YouTube. I did a little short video on it myself as well, of his contest with Kid Herman. And this is one of the most beautiful knockouts you can see on film. And this happened way back when. It might have been around 1900, could have been just before or just after 1900. I can't remember the exact date. But that being said, it was one of the most beautiful knockouts that you can see on film. The way he catches Kid Herman with a short right. It's almost a sort of uppercut or a hook. It just came at the right placement, sent him down and out. And he was out for reported 30 minutes, somewhere in that neighborhood, before they were able to get him fully revived and in standing. So that's just another example. And then, of course, we can think about others as well. But those are some certainly worth highlighting.
Nice. Have you done Ketchel?
Yes,
I'm
yes,
trying to remember.
actually, yeah. There is a video on the great Stanley Ketchel as well. Another one of those guys noted for his punch. I think what really puts it into perspective is, of course, him dropping Jack Johnson in a contest where they competed, and you can just see that him being a middleweight, what he was able to lay into that punch and really send Johnson down, who seemingly wasn't expecting him to come with that much force. But that just goes to show you, but also Ketchel in there with some other top level names as a fighter. Of course, his series with Billy Papke, probably the more notable of the bunch. And I think that kind of speaks to who Ketchel was and kind of how people got to get behind him as a fighter. And of course, he died at 24 years of age, was murdered at that particular age. So therefore, he had already put in a lot of work as a fighter, 50 plus fights in the books by that time, and would have to expect probably a number of more fights left in him, though we didn't get to fully see that come to fruition. But he made a name for himself just by virtue of what he was able to do in that particular time period. Another guy, Terrible Terry McGovern, I have a video on him as well. Most notably, his fight with Joe Gans is one that people will tie to Terry Norris, featherweight champion of the world, former, and a big puncher during his period or during that era. And I think that he is someone you can mention amongst those who just think about able to get the job done, able to get opponents out of there. He is one of them. Then there's a litany of them. We have other videos on the channel. Of course, Bob Fitzsimmons. We know the greatness of the great Bob Fitzsimmons. Varying videos on Jack Dempsey. Then, of course, John L. Sullivan himself, as random mention, who was the first superstar in the sport of boxing during his era, and he did it largely by his ability to get opponents out of there, usually quick, fast, and in a hurry. Noted for his travels across the country and the world in other countries as well, challenging fighters to stand with him for 4 rounds or less. Or at least if they could stand with him for 4 rounds, they would win a large sum of money. But in most cases, pretty much all cases, it was less than that. And Sullivan was the victor. Of course, we know he lost in his final fight of his career against the great James J. Corbett. But that being said, certainly someone who during his time was noted for his ability and his punch, more specifically, just the offensive, aggressive arsenal and nature of how he operated was one that built him a lot of cachet and fan support. Though we didn't get to see him take on the very best in all contests or his era in total, for what he was able to do, he certainly made a name and stood out during that particular period.
Nice, nice. Yeah, there's just a man. Yeah, that was a good rant right there, brother. I just thrown up some Langford footage. I love this. This is one of possibly my favorite thing captured on video of Langford. Just dig, just vicious punch to the body, just grazed him with the uppercut, steps square, parry, comes underneath, counter left, knocks him off balance. The guy's got 30 pounds on him, knocks him off balance from a square stance with a parry counter. Look at this. It's poetry. It's poetry in motion. Look at that, cracks him right on the side of the chin. But those body shots right there, his ability, because he was set low and he was so stocky, his ability to throw viciously from short range was famous. That's part of the appeal of Joe Louis, the great Joe Louis. Among the many things to be excited about him over was his short power with either hand from any distance, and that's what Langford was rolling with. If you got close, he could rip you apart, especially the body, but pretty much anywhere. But it's the body can't duck. So, but if you stayed at mid range, he could cut the ring and force you to lead and counter or use his feints, his very educated left hand to throw off your thing. And then at long range, like when he was mobile, he was so good at cutting the ring, it was hard to get away from him for long enough to not eat some power. I mean, there were guys who were able to get draws with him when he was at his very best. But so it was like when he lost some mobility, that's when you could see guys start to keep him at the end of punches, or when he came out of shape in the first fight with Gumbo Smith. He got kept on the end of that jab. Later in 17, Fred Fulton, a lot of the damage that Langford suffered in his eye because he was stuck on the end of this jab. Obviously, Fulton could punch with either hand, but when Langford was fully mobile, that artillery, it was hard to stay away from it, even if you tried to. Like the first fight where McVeigh had a 20-round draw with Paris, in Paris in 1911, April, a lot of people in the crowd didn't like that decision because he wasn't leading. Langford was pushing the action. In their second fight at the end of the year, when McVeigh got the decision over Langford, again, people didn't like it because Langford was leading. He was pushing it, but he was also eating some stuff because McVeigh was so good on the retreat. So you'll have that in the win-loss column. Doesn't always tell he couldn't stop this guy, this and this. There are times when fighters were definitely trying to stay away from Langford. In fact, all the smart ones tried to stay out of the way of that power. And some more successfully than others, but it was hard to get in close. That short power makes a difference. Same with Louis. You really want to try and tie up Joe Louis? You really want to trade shots close like that to a guy whose whole positioning, his whole training is designed to be able to deliver it from anywhere at all times without warning. That shuffling style, Langford had maybe a more evolved version of that shuffling style, but of course Louis, Blackburn had to get Joe Louis better footwork to go with his crazy power. Langford always had good footwork. I'm trying to think, the last report I see of Langford looking like a novice is like his second amateur fight. He'd won the first fight, and in the second fight, one of the two Boston newspapers said that Jack McVicker made him look like a novice. Other than that, I don't remember seeing a report, where it was like he didn't already have good technique, because he was sparring and he was around quality fighters heavier than him. Like George Byers was heavier than him when he was first working with him. Jimmy Walsh was lighter than him the whole time they were ever associated with each other. So, delivery systems. Someone asked in the chat, Someone asked in the chat about, did Langford hit harder when he was heavier, as he put on weight? I think that's a good question. It might have balanced out because he didn't have the mobility and he wasn't as fast as he had once been, but he did have a lot more mass. And so if you were close to him, maybe he was more dangerous, but in the way fighters are able to game plan, maybe he couldn't deliver it as easily because he didn't have that cat-like mobility. Like his dexterity was abnormal, as well as his sense of distance and timing. So you can see in the Bill Lang fight, he's telling jokes. He's telling knock-knock jokes with Bill Lang's psychology, like the patterns of feints and feinting and then jabbing the body, feinting and then, throwing the lead hook, the lead left hook, his famous hook, or jabbing the body, then coming, or jab the body, feint a couple times low, feint high, feint low again, and then come over the top with a giant overhand. There was nowhere safe from him when he was at his best. That's what made him so dangerous. That power enabled that. You took that power away, he's not the same guy. You take anyone's best attribute, you don't let Ali take any steps in the ring, he's not the same guy. So obviously it goes without saying, but Langford's power really just set him apart. And I think, you think, Josh, it's fair to say the same goes for Fitz, how he was able to, not just his science, but the fact that he could crack as hard as he could, his fists could take it, that he didn't become like a bad point fighter. You always had to look out for the power past his prime, as was true with Langford. Also Marciano,
yep.
He retired, he was having back problems. He wasn't at his prime in those later fights. Physically, even though he didn't compete that many years, I think it was 8 seasons, but even though he did put a lot of wear and tear because of his training regimen. And so, he was having back issues. So probably the Cockle fight or a couple of those last fights, even against Hall of Famers, he wasn't the same guy himself. Couldn't move quite the same way. Hey, my friend. Sorry, I'm just pulling at work. One of my buddies here. So, Josh, I'm about to head in and do the business overnight. And I want to thank you for joining me. Thanks for everyone for listening. And look for the video, folks. Also look for hopefully soon our part 4 prime versus prime matchups, right, Josh?
Yes, indeed. More to come. Thank you, Random. Appreciate you bringing me on the channel. Always great to discuss some of the history, as I always mention. But certainly, thank you for everyone who tuned in. Great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for spending some time with us, folks. And shout out to Scrapbook Boxing and the Boxing Librarian, and to you, 86. And have a great day, folks. Take care.